Welcome to episode 3 of our Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast. Today we will be reviewing Austin Powers' International Man of Mystery from 1997, directed by Jay Roach and written by Mike Myers. It is a comedic spoof of James Bond films and similar spy movies from the 1960s and follows a psychedelic 60s English spy brought out of cryogenic preservation in 1997 to fight and defeat his arch-nemesis Dr. Evil with the assistance of his sidekick and love interest Vanessa Kensington.
Mm-hmm.
The film stars Mike Myers as both Austin Powers and Dr. Evil, Elizabeth Hurley as Vanessa, Michael York as Basil Exposition, Robert Wagner as Number 2, Seth Green as Scott Evil, and Carrie Fisher as Therapist.
Yes! That starring role.
So I'll play off of Zach's outline from the last episode, pretty much, in the beginning.
Okay.
What were your guys' overall impression of this movie? So either of you can go first.
Do you want to start, Christian?
Sure, I'll go first. My Twitter review on Twitter at ImageWandering, if you're interested in following me, I gave it a 2.5 out of 5, and that's my critical ranking. And personally, I would say I enjoyed it probably more than 2.5 out of 5. I had a great deal of fun watching it. And for me, from a critical perspective, it felt to me like parts of it didn't age well, at least at the time that I wrote the review. And the more that I've thought about it, I think that Austin Powers probably isn't such an awful character in that, like Mitchell said, it's kind of meant to spoof the Bond type stuff where they're just the most debonair Adonis protagonist character. And the fact that it's just Mike Myers with an absurd amount of body hair is in some ways, for lack of a better term, enjoyable to watch. So, yeah, Mike Myers is great. And I said, as far as sleazy comedies go, it's satisfactory, and to some extent, the genre defies criticism. So I had fun.
All right. I would say that I found this film consistently funny, but sort of exhausting. And I have this issue with other Mike Myers comedies as well, but there's pretty much every single scene is just joke after joke after joke, and there's constant wordplay and constant sight gags, and the movie never really stops to breathe and doesn't really have any kind of a straight element to sort of help the viewer through the jokes. So at a certain point, although it's still funny, I find myself sort of going, oh gosh, can we stop? I'm sick of laughing. And it's sort of... it sort of wore me down and exhausted me in that manner. It kind of felt like a bunch of consistently funny SNL gags strung together into a movie. Like, I feel like you could take every scene from this movie and put it on an episode of SNL and it wouldn't be out of place whatsoever. And I feel like it would be entertaining if it was like a storyline that stretched out across multiple episodes of SNL, a scene per episode or something like that. But watching it all together sort of exhausted me, like I mentioned previously.
Okay. Yeah, no, I can definitely see that. I feel as though there were some scenes that were they weren't really breathing scenes necessarily, like even like when they were anytime that like Austin and Vanessa are together, and they're not like making a skit. I feel like those are the only moments where it's really like there's not a time where it's supposed to be exclusively funny, or they're just shoving it in the viewer's face the entire time.
Mm-hmm.
Like the bedroom scene. The bedroom scene. There's like 3.
Yes.
You
have to be more.
I'm trying to be more descriptive because they changed locations.
About.
Yeah, it's
the
one
with
that
the
Christian.
nutshell?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I think so.
I don't remember. But yeah, anytime I feel as though there's actually a consistent theme, which I've never really noticed before until I started viewing this critically, was the theme of generational gaps. So you kind of have Scott, who's like the 90s Gen Zer, who's like just sick of everything all the time. And I personally like Seth Green as an actor.
Yeah.
But that, the father-son relationship is actually kind of realistic, which is partially why there is some genuine humor to be found there that isn't just artificial. And then the same thing between Vanessa and Austin is also kind of that's a constant reoccurring thing, that Austin has a problem with the way the 90s are, and Vanessa has a problem with the way that Austin is, which is actually kind of an interesting perspective to see from 2020, because Vanessa kind of exemplifies what like the average, not well I wouldn't say, let me be careful with my words, but
Yes.
she for the 90s, she shows feminist tendencies that are especially feminist when you look at the 60s. And I feel as though that she's a moral guide kind of for the audience, even for 2020. I feel like she's a very good, moral guide to follow, even though she kind of gets wooed by Austin once in a while, which is kind of I mean, it adds to the charm of Austin Powers' character, because otherwise his whole shtick wouldn't really work. So I mean, there's good and bad there. But in term, I overall I really did like this movie. I've watched, I believe, almost all of the Bond films, if not all of them.
Wow.
There might be one or two that slipped through there. But all of the references from older ones I got, like even a lot of vagina. She's supposed to be Fiona Volpe from Thunderball. And then Odd Job is probably the most obvious one.
Oh, yeah.
Random Task.
Yes.
Blofeld, obviously, from You Only Live Twice. And I think the spinning bed, I think that's from the original Casino Royale.
Oh, the TV version? Yeah, maybe. Or the comedy one, or there's a couple of different versions of that.
Whichever one, I don't really remember. One lost in the wind.
Yes.
But yeah, no, for being a James Bond fan, I think it helps a little bit, but I feel as though Mike Myers this is his movie, really, kind of like Wayne's World. He really takes this movie and runs with it. Without him, most of this movie wouldn't be funny at all. But I would say a lot of the humor is not necessarily like really complicated, or it's really blatant, but in a good way. And how blunt everything is there's some parts that are more entertaining to see now, and other ones that kind of just die off.
Yes.
Over time.
Yeah.
And a lot of the 90s references also we wouldn't really understand either. There is one thing that was interesting about that. Princess Diana, when they mentioned the affair, the Prince Charles affair.
Yeah.
Apparently they cut that out in the UK version until this year, when Sony premiered Classic, their classic movies, and they just this year they added it back in. And the reason why is because Princess Diana actually died in 1997. So.
Oh, I didn't know it was that late. I thought it was before that.
Yep. So I thought that was interesting. But is there anything are there any like favorite scenes you guys have, or ones that really stuck out that kind of made you think twice about the humor, or is everything kind of just like a flat line?
I wouldn't say this isn't necessarily a good scene that stood out to me, but I was doing some research afterward, and I read that Mike Myers has said that like something like 40 to 60% of the movie was probably improvised. And there's a couple scenes where I think you can really tell, particularly the scene where he punches Basil Exposition's mother.
Yeah.
That feels like a scene that somebody improvised and then wasn't willing to let go of in the edit, because I feel like there's a couple scenes like this throughout the movie where the joke doesn't really make any sense. Like, for me, it's very difficult to criticize comedy, because comedy's very subjective. I mean, all I can really say is I didn't find it funny, and somebody else can say, well, I did, and then the conversation's pretty much over. But for me at least, I think that for something to be funny, for a punchline to actually pack that punch, the setup needs to make sense and be something that you could actually see happening, so that when that punchline comes, whoa, that was unexpected, it took me off guard. And in that scene, all I could think is, why is Basil Exposition's mother in the spy headquarters? Like, it feels like I want to punch a woman because I think she's a man, is the joke. And then they worked funny. And then they worked backwards to find the setup, but they already had, and then the setup doesn't really make sense with the situation that they're in. The other things like the gag of Scott says, I think my dad wants to kill me. And then Carrie Fisher's therapist character says, "Oh, I'm sure he's not trying to kill you." And he says, "Oh, well, I actually am." And then that never really comes to anything later in the movie. I mean,
Right.
there's the scene with the button where he almost fries him alive, but then immediately after that, he seems concerned over him. So there's jokes like that I feel like maybe came up in improv and people thought they were funny, but when you look at them a little closer, they don't make much sense. Those were kind of the scenes that stood out to me, but yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if I have a specific scene. I just have difficulty remembering every gag, but I generally found it very funny, and I think personally I understand Zach's point of it being comedically exhausting, but the scenes, the few and far between scenes in which it wasn't comedically exhausting, like the sincere moment on the bed where Austin is talking about how letting Mrs. Kensington slip through his fingers was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. Like that, to me, that felt like completely out of left field.
Yeah.
And I almost prefer the barrage of absurdity and slapstick to shoehorn sincere moments for the sake of the plot. But outside of that, I some of my favorite things were the more mundane jokes, like the fact that Basil Exposition's name is Basil Exposition.
Yeah.
Like that, to me, that's perhaps the funniest thing in the entire film. So
I thought there was a real missed opportunity in. It's actually the same scene where Austin punches Basil Exposition's mother, but he says before that I have two great fears, and one of them is nuclear war. And I thought, if they leave it there, that will be hilarious. And then they just don't ask about the second great fear, and then it just kind of hangs in the air. And then they go on this weird, diatribe about carnies and people with small hands. And I thought, wait, no, you had, a great deadpan joke, and then you, improv'd it to death. But I thought, I did think some of the bits where it was just kind of a little bit of deadpan humor that never really was acknowledged, I found that kind of the funniest stuff in the movie.
I have a confession, actually, real quick. About 37 minutes into the movie, I was like, oh, I really like this Dr. Evil character. I might like him even more than Austin Powers. I wonder who plays him.
Right.
I swear, I had no idea that Mike Myers played both Austin Powers and Dr. Evil until 37 minutes into the film, and I was on IMDb. And I figured it out by looking it up.
Right.
I truly had no clue.
That really speaks to his acting.
Yeah, I guess that's more credit to him.
Yeah. And that also probably comes from his SNL experience, too.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
I don't know what else I have to say.
Oh.
Burt Bacharach, I like that. I like the date scene.
Yeah.
I thought the Burt Bacharach inclusion was weird, but that's kind of the sort of weird running gag I like in this kind of movie. I was also really impressed by the character of Dr. Evil, and I think he's sort of one of the funniest things in the movie. And I read that originally Mike Myers wanted to cast Jim Carrey in that role and only cast himself because Jim didn't want to get involved or had conflicts.
Yeah, with the Liar Liar.
Yeah, I think it's great that Jim Carrey wasn't able to get involved because I don't think 90s Jim Carrey would have brought anywhere near the same kind of humor to this character that Mike Myers does. Because I think the funniest thing about Dr. Evil is that he's just such a normal, mundane guy. That's kind of where the humor comes from, is that he's just a guy, and he's always behaving in such a mundane way with his employees, and well, what do I pay you for, and things like that. And I think Jim Carrey would have seriously overplayed that, so I'm kind of glad he didn't get involved with the movie.
Yeah, definitely.
Forgive the sound intrusion. There's quite a few people on my street honking their horns, I think wishing their friend a happy 50th birthday remotely. So I'm going to mute my mic for a second here.
Right.
I will say the most difficult part of this movie for me to kind of get around is to separate the comedy from the excessive goofiness, I think. I think it's a part of its charm, but the charm doesn't really age well. And I keep repeating that, but that's really, I think that's probably the one thing that really holds this back, especially for today's standards. But if I had to describe this in any one way, I would say it's uncomfortable comedy. Just because I feel as though there's both uncomfortable there's uncomfortable humor where it's funny and you don't like that you think that it's funny, but it also makes you human to think that it's funny because other people agree with you. And
Good
then there's
point.
other parts where it's just straight up like disgusting or just like toilet jokes or something like that. And like that bathroom scene with the cowboy is kind of just, out of left field.
Yeah.
But I mean, anytime Austin or Dr. Evil are on the screen or both, you're really when you're trying to look for what's actually funny. I mean, they're going to be the ones that deliver it every single time. So, once again, this is Mike Myers' one of his crown jewels, and I think he's actually said that before. But yeah, he actually developed Austin Powers based on his family's reaction to him trying a British accent and being flirty with his girlfriend at the time, or actually his wife, and his dad's interest in comedy actors, like Peter Sellers and Alec Guinness, actually.
Yeah.
So that's definitely interesting. Yeah, I mean, honestly, when this movie ended, I didn't really feel like it ended. Like it felt kind of short, but like Zach was saying, it felt like SNL skits strung together in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So there wasn't you didn't totally feel like a progression, but I do like the dichotomy between Dr. Evil and Austin Powers, even though it's really simplistic and it's not too difficult to decipher. But if you have Dr. Evil and his son, their dynamic is kind of like a sideline to the simplistic plot, and then you have Austin and Vanessa dealing with their own thing.
Yeah.
So having those three general events happening at the same time is very satisfying, I think, in my opinion, in terms of organization. But yeah, is there any reason why you guys what was the main reason for giving it a 2 out of 5 and a 2.5 out of 5 instead of a 3 or higher?
Well, I mean, I've mentioned before that for me, the actual number or numerical rating is largely arbitrary. I mean,
boy, here we go.
Sometimes I honestly think that the number rating just subconsciously comes from what the color of the poster is and things along those lines. What matters is kind of the way I end up describing it. But I do think a big part of why I gave it that rating is that after like the first third, I really was kind of not sick of it, but sort of worn down, and I feel like the straight element of this movie that's kind of meant to take you through the jokes is Austin's romance with Vanessa, at least to a certain extent. I think that's meant to sort of be the straight story that helps you through all the goofiness.
Right.
But I really don't like that romance. That romance feels more like watching a woman succumb to Stockholm syndrome than watching two people actually fall in love. So that straight element just didn't work for me. So at a certain point, it sort of became just a process of having jokes thrown at me, and I found some of them amusing. A lot of them I didn't find very amusing, but I just kind of chuckled every now and then the movie was over. It just didn't really leave much of an impression on me.
Yeah, those are all fair points. I think for me, I felt similarly about Austin and Vanessa, and to me, their getting together is sort of a fundamental contradiction of Austin's character and what makes him so funny. And I know we weren't required to watch the second film for this sake, but do you all know what happens at the beginning of the second film?
Does she die?
I remember.
She attacks Austin, and it turns out she's a fembot, and she was a fembot the entire time.
Yeah.
And Basil Exposition is just like, oh, well, of course we knew all along she was a fembot. It's just a plot device to restore Austin back to where he was basically at the beginning of the first film, so that you can get that groovy and the whatever back from him.
Are his teeth bad again in the second one as well? I was wondering that, because he fixes his teeth at the ending of the first one.
I'm not sure. There's a lot of time travel mumbo jumbo, so I think maybe at some point. But anyway, I think Mitchell's points about the humor being an uncomfortable sort of humor that makes us human because we share our enjoyment of it is a really good point. But even with that being said, to some extent, I have a more difficult time enjoying it because of my discomfort. That's just a personal thing. But outside of that, it was very fun. And my last note is, I think a movie like this can be more fun when watched with friends or a group of people who you share some sort of comedic interest with and sense of humor, and like I'm sure we would have had great fun watching this together. If we were to have the means to actually see each other during this time.
Yes.
So I mean, yeah. But outside of that, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the parts that I felt guilty about enjoying. It was fun.
Yeah, it definitely was fun.
Yeah.
There wasn't any point where I kind of just wanted to turn it off or anything like that. It really exists it exists in and of itself to accomplish what it wants to do, and it does that. And you can either take what you want from it, or just leave it. And I think that's its best and worst feature. And a lot of movies in this genre, particularly in this time period, are really reliant on being comedies. They're very self-aware, and they're self-aware to the point where they can rely on that to get away with a lot of plot holes and things like that. So you can kind of just be like, oh, the movie, they must have known that, the director must have known that was a plot hole, or like the director's like, I mean, most of the time we know that most of the time they just leave it in there and they don't bother adjusting it just because they just want to add more fuel to the craziness going on screen. We can say
Zach's
that
point.
What were you gonna say?
Sorry to cut in, but to Zach's point, with the improvisation bits, I had no idea that any of it was improvised. But now that you're pointing it out to me, and you cited the specific instance with the therapist and the Basil Exposition's mother.
Yes.
For some reason, I still find that absolutely hilarious. I know it's not clever in any way, shape, or form. But anyway, I did not know they were improvised at all. But now that you've mentioned it, I can sort of tell that they feel out of place. So I don't know. Do the jokes necessarily need to fulfill a broader connective purpose to merit a spot in the film?
I wouldn't necessarily say so, but I feel like, as somebody who's done improv, I mean, I feel like we've all done improv, at least to some extent, at some point. But
not as much as you.
Well, at some points in improv, you do, at a lot of points actually, you end up with these dead end jokes, which are kind of funny in the moment, because it's like, whoa, where did that come from? But then once you start to think about it, or once you watch them like a second time, or watch them back, because I watched this one 2 times as well, you sort of start to recognize, wait a minute, that doesn't make much sense. It kind of falls into what my opinion of what a comedy should be. But I feel that if you're going to make a feature-length comedy, then one of your priorities should be the story. And you can put a ton of goofy gags in there, you can put in a ton of jokes, but those jokes should all line up in some way with the story that you're telling and make sense with that story. And I feel like a lot of the jokes in this, it feels sort of first drafty. Like they thought, okay, well, this will be a fun thing to put in there because this is kind of like a thing from James Bond. And then they kind of hung it on their storyboard. And then they didn't really go back through to flesh out the connections and make sure everything had a definite purpose in the story, if that makes any sense. There are things there that feel like, well, this is a fun James Bond joke, or this is a fun 60s sex comedy joke, but they don't feel like they serve the story necessarily, which is, I feel like all gags and scenes in a comedy should in some way serve the story, but that might just be me.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's one man's opinion.
Yes.
Yeah, I did not watch Austin Powers for the intensity of the plot or the intrigue of the story, but to each his own.
Well,
clearly Zach didn't do that for A New Hope either, so.
Oh no. Oh, we'll get there.
Yes.
I opened the Pandora's box and now I'm closing it. So.
Yes, close that box.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I think I've mentioned pretty much all I wanted to mention. Will Ferrell, eh?
Yeah. Will Ferrell is fun in this.
For the 2 times he's on screen, yeah.
That's one of the, I think the, I've just been very badly burned gag. I think that's one of the best gags in the movie.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, sure.
Because like I mentioned, it has that contrast. It has, you expect this to be like a Bond villain style death, or it pretty much is a Bond villain style death, except for the one thing, oh, he doesn't die. There's that one thing adding contrast, and it just keeps building on itself based on that contrast. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just like the sharks with the frickin' lasers.
Yes. Yeah, that's another example. I mean, I would say, like I mentioned, all the best gags in the movie, I think, come from that contrast of, it's a regular Bond style thing, except for this one thing that really shouldn't be there, and kind of throws everything off.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The UN being in like a circle, and just being stereotypical.
In just one small room, yeah.
Yeah.
With beef eaters and people in like headdresses.
Right. Yeah. Do you think for the well, okay. Do you think for the 90s that it is, do you think that it stands firm as a comedy for the 90s, as far as either of you know?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I feel like Zach said, critically evaluating a comedy is sort of a bottomless pit to some extent, and I have enjoyed this more than any soulless Adam Sandler led film. So I mean, yeah, I think it holds up
Ace
just fine.
Ventura,
Well,
Jumanji.
I kind of tend to avoid. I tend to avoid most films, especially comedies and sort of like teen films from the 90s, because I think in many ways 90s comedies have kind of dated very badly nowadays. I think a lot of stuff from the 90s has dated very, very badly, to be honest.
Right.
I feel like compared to other 90s comedies, this film stacks up relatively well. I think the big reason it might not gel with me necessarily is just that I prefer kind of that more deadpan, maybe a little more kind of mean-spirited tone of comedy. And if there's one thing you can say for this film, it's that it's not mean-spirited at all. This is a very goofy, fun comedy. I can definitely... It's sort of, I suppose, I think this is kind of the epitome of the film you put on the lazy Saturday afternoon. You can kind of have it on in the background while you do other stuff. I mean, and you can kind of you can tune in and out to the gags. You don't necessarily need to keep up with the story, and I think it serves that purpose well. But it's just not necessarily my thing. Neither is kind of most of its sort of specific genre, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, is there any final thoughts you guys have on the film? Is there anything you would like to tell people who have not seen it? Well, should they see it? Should people see this? Would you recommend?
Would you like to start, Christian?
Sure. I mean, yeah, as long as you don't mind Will Ferrell wearing mild brown face and a fez. I mean, yeah, sure.
I didn't even think about that, to be honest. But
I didn't even think about that either.
Yeah. Yeah, it had to be mentioned at the very least, but at least he's not like, I don't know. It could have been a lot worse in terms of it being.
He was being Will Ferrell. He was being Will Ferrell.
Yeah,
pretty much.
He doesn't do like a voice or anything like that. He's pretty much just Will Ferrell in a fez.
Yeah.
So
I've been very badly burned.
Yeah, to answer your question, sure, I'd recommend it to anyone that's looking for a comedy that doesn't mind something too sleazy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would say, would I watch it again? Probably not. Am I glad that I watched it once? Yeah, twice. Maybe a bit too much. But I am glad I watched it once. I found it relatively fun. I would put this on the stack with movies like. I think I'd put this maybe a little bit below movies like The Naked Gun and Airplane. It kind of falls into that same kind of lighthearted, goofy, gag-a-minute comedy. It's definitely not for everybody, and if you're looking for, a comedy that's gonna stand up to the test of time and always be funny every single time you watch it, I don't think I'd necessarily recommend this, but I think it's amusing, and it's got some fun aspects in there that I think might be fun to come back to every now and then. I think Scott and Basil Exposition are weirdly maybe my favorite things in the movie. I really like Michael York as Basil Exposition. He knows exactly what kind of movie he's in, and he's having a ball with it. So I'm glad I watched it once. Yeah.
Scott and Basil are the two halves of Zach's personality.
Right. Yeah, trying to get into this call, he was being a real Basil, so. Yeah, I enjoyed this. This is triggering the same part in my brain that the Nutty Professor and Dumb and Dumber do. I personally like Dumb and Dumber and the Nutty Professor just because I think it's funnier than this, but maybe because I've seen this so many times. I do like the sequel better, but
really?
I'm not going to talk about the sequel too much. But but yeah, you really, if you liked, and Wayne's World, obviously, if you liked Mike Myers in Wayne's World and you want to see him as an English spy, being way too aggressively sexual with everything all the time, trying to be James Bond, then that's quite literally what this was trying to be. It was what it was advertised to be, what it was written to be, and what it actually was on the screen. So
yeah,
it's exactly, you're pretty much coming in exactly knowing what to expect, but. Like Christian had said, don't expect this to be really hyper complicated or anything. I mean, this is
yeah,
it's a comedy, so it's not anything to be taken too seriously. Especially the fembots, please.
Oh yes.
Rest easy. But yeah. Any other thoughts, or Christian? Do you want to start? Our thing, or we should start our thing.
It's time for part 2 of the rundown.
Oh no, back in front of the firing squad.
Yeah, so we're just gonna rapid fire hit Zach with as many topics as we can from this film in the space of 60 seconds. And Mitchell's gonna lead off on this one, and I've got a timer on my phone to make sure we don't exceed our time.
All right.
Mitchell, are you ready?
Yes.
3,
I'm ready.
2, 1, go.
The term shaggadelic.
Oh, 1 out of 5.
Number 2.
3 out of 5.
The Jaguar.
2 out of 5.
The 60s.
Oh, 4 out of 5.
Austin's wardrobe.
Oh, 3 out of 5.
Mike Myers.
4 out of 5.
Oh, behave.
2 out of 5.
Oh, behave.
2 out of 5.
Staying on 5 in Blackjack.
Oh, 4 out of 5.
Mike Myers playing the protagonist and antagonist.
4 out of 5.
Basil Exposition.
3 out of 5.
The 90s.
2 out of 5.
Will Ferrell in Brownface and a Fez.
You don't have to put it at 3 out of 5.
The dialogue.
2 out of 5.
Carrie Fisher cameos.
3 out of 5.
The unfreezing process.
3 out of 5.
Fembots.
2 out of 5.
The perfectly applicable PG-13 rating.
Throw
3 out
back
of
rack
5.
1 second.
2 out of 5.
Good job.
Okay.
Oh no. Don't rate the last one.
Did we overrun?
We missed one term,
Oh,
but
shoot.
that's the nature of the rundown.
Oh.
We get in what we can.
We'll never know what that last one was.
Never.
And neither will you, listeners.
Yeah. This is fun. I like this. I like this. This was fun. This was fun. I wish I had seen it with you guys. I'm not gonna lie. I wish I had
me
seen
too.
it with you guys.
Me too.
Yeah.
I was just pretty much sitting here in my basement at 2 a.m. listening and watching it, not laughing at all, just taking notes. So,
Wow.
I could have enjoyed it a lot more, but it's fine.
Well, do we want to segue to Christian introducing our?
Yeah.
Hello,
Hello. I'm
watching
Christian.
boy.
Our next episode will be Rogue One, a Star Wars story, the first standalone film outside of the Skywalker saga that Disney made, directed by Gareth Edwards, and it's, critically speaking, I think a fantastic film. It's one of my personal favorites, and we're gonna be watching it, and that episode will be out after this one on a Monday. Yes, we'll be releasing on a Monday.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
if you're into Star Wars and all that lot, tune into that, and yeah, it'll be fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Glad to host this time. Had a fun time.
Ooh.
Mm-hmm.
And I will see you all next time.